So until recently, in my opinion, Exodus has not been particularly well served in terms of commentaries. And generally, Old Testament commentaries on Genesis, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and Isaiah are assured of good sales. Of course, I would love it if commentaries on Ecclesiastes sold the best, but it is intriguing that Exodus is not, as I understand it, generally amongst best-selling commentaries. Why, we might ask, is this the case? When I was writing God Who Acts in History, The Significance of Sinai, I discovered that not only is Exodus not a major priority amongst commentators' readers, but also that Christian theologians rarely devote substantial attention to Exodus Sinai, if at all. One might argue that our theologians have enough to deal with in the Christ event, but I find this an inadequate argument. One cannot, in my view, understand the Christ event fully apart from Exodus Sinai. Perhaps the specter of Marcion still casts its shadow over biblical studies and theology, or perhaps the loss of confidence in divine action and thus of revelation with which Exodus is awash has prevented us from seeing just how central Exodus Sinai is for the Old Testament, indeed for the Bible as a whole. Studies in the development of the canon of the Old Testament tend to focus on the terminus ad quem of the formation of the canon. This is surely important, but in my view, we do far better to focus most of our attention on the terminus a quo, that from which the Old Testament canon originates. Once take God's revelation in history and historical narrative seriously, and Sinai immediately moves front and center. There are, I suggest, two mountains of revelation in the Bible: Exodus Sinai and the Christ event. I am more and more of the opinion that in the Old Testament, all roads lead to and from Sinai. Sinai is a veritable explosion of revelation, fulfilled in and exceeded only by the Christ event. In his The Mission of God, Chris Wright articulates well the significance of the Exodus Sinai event for the Bible as a whole when he writes, "The Exodus, of course, was not God's only redeeming act, or even in a full biblical perspective his greatest. But it is the first that is described as such in the Bible, and the rest of the Bible clearly takes it as paradigmatic. That is, the Exodus models for us the contours of what God himself means by redemption, even if, of course, it was not yet all he planned to do in his redemptive purpose for humanity and creation." Chris asserts of the Exodus that in the Old Testament, it stands as a sine qua non event that is quite deliberately seen as analogous to the cross and resurrection of Christ. Now, we articulate it in different ways, but I think we agree that if this is true, that bearing in mind that the Israelites only leave Sinai in Numbers chapter 10, then if there is this explosion of revelation at Sinai, one would expect a huge amount of attention to be paid to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and of course to Deuteronomy, which recapitulates Sinai as the Israelites are about to enter the promised land. Now, alas, this has not been the case for Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, although when it comes to Exodus, it appears that the tide is turning. As is so often the case in Old Testament studies, the tide turns to an extent from unexpected quarters. Now, Dave mentioned a number of the commentaries that have been coming out on Exodus, and I think a major event, 2021 is clearly a major event for Exodus commentaries. Leon Cass published, the American Jewish bioethicist, published his blockbuster commentary, which Chris quoted. Chris's commentary has appeared. The first two volumes of Graham Davies of Cambridge, his ICC commentary, have appeared. Mark Scolata's, which is a very interesting work, The Abiding Presence, a theological commentary on Exodus, was published in 2018. And Desmond Alexander's Apollos commentary, which is very large, was published in 2017. I haven't yet had time to have a close look at Alexander's commentary, but in my opinion, Cass's and Wright's commentaries stand out as of particular importance for those of us concerned to hear God's comprehensive address through the Bible. Now, I want to suggest, and I hope Chris doesn't mind me doing this, that both are somewhat unusual. Cass is not a biblical scholar, but through close attention to Genesis and Exodus, he has now produced two genuinely unique and seminal commentaries, reading through the lens of his wisdom-seeking hermeneutic. In the process, he foregrounds dimensions of these two books that are, alas, rarely touched upon by most commentators. Chris is, by contrast, an Old Testament scholar with a speciality in Old Testament ethics, but he is also, and this is a bit unusual in the Old Testament guild, tarried long in the fields of missiology, both academically and practically, and brings his fresh missional perspective to Exodus. Indeed, it is notable in his commentary that he reads with the global church. Cass seeks wisdom for all of life and produces a remarkable commentary as a result. And Wright seeks knowledge of God's mission and how we fit within that. And the result is that both have provided us with very stimulating and fresh commentaries. For exegesis, preaching, and teaching, Wright is my top pick. As one reads through his lucid, well-written commentary, one is reminded of just what a challenging task commentary work is when it's done well. And it's also as though, and Chris has produced so many seminal works, but when you read his commentary on Exodus, you do get the feeling that he's been preparing to write this all his life. In my limited time, I draw your attention to a number of reasons for my assessment. First of all, the historicity of Exodus. In his introduction, Chris attends briefly, as is appropriate in this series, to the composition and historicity of Exodus. Historical criticism has complicated this monumentally, and we're now in a situation where the majority view seems to be that there was no Exodus, there was no Sinai, but that Israel emerged from within the land of Canaan. Chris is careful and nuanced in his defense of the historicity of Exodus, but rightly notes that, and I quote, "To imagine that the Exodus never happened at all would be to make nonsense of vast swathes of the rest of the Old Testament, in which it is assumed without question as the monumental proof of the power of Israel's God Yahweh, and the evidence on which so much of their faith, worship, and social ideals were based. It would do the same, of course, to the identical assumption in the New Testament. Here are two things in relation to the historicity of Exodus Sinai should be noted. Firstly, one's view of the historicity of Exodus is profoundly shaped by one's view of divine action. Chris referred to my engagement with Benjamin Sommer's work, who argues that although something happened at Sinai, but because, and here he follows Maimonides, the nature of God is such that he cannot speak, and of course it follows very logically that if he cannot speak, then he did not speak. Once assume, as do I and Chris, that God certainly can and does speak and act, then one's approach to Exodus Sinai is utterly transformed. Secondly, a major element in Chris's view of Exodus Sinai's historicity is its place within the biblical story and the Bible as a whole. To subvert the historicity of Exodus Sinai does not just tinker with the biblical story, but turns it, I would argue, into a different story. And thus, I think Chris is absolutely right to take this into account in terms of the basic historicity of Exodus, and so should we. As the living God active in history has disappeared from much mainstream Old Testament scholarship, so too has Moses. And in the place of Moses, what we have is an infinite number of anonymous scribes responsible for the final form of the text developed over centuries. What is intriguing about the historicity of Exodus is that when you reintroduce God and divine action with Yahweh as the central character, Moses comes out of the shadows into focus again as an historical person. And so, in my opinion, Chris rightly defends the substantial mosaicity of Exodus without succumbing to a fundamentalist affirmation of Moses' authorship of the entire Pentateuch. So first of all, historicity. Second, listening to Exodus. In my Introducing Biblical Hermeneutics, I propose that we ground hermeneutics in listening. One thing I love about the Story of the Bible commentary series is that the first part in each section is entitled Listen to the Story. In our event with Leon Cass earlier this year, he spoke eloquently of living with the text of Exodus over years. And a similar attentive listening seems to me clearly evident in Chris's commentary, a listening that allows the different dimensions of the acoustics of the text of Exodus to be heard. Exodus is part of the Pentateuch and part of the Old Testament and part of the Bible as a whole. And Chris's listening carefully teases out these different contexts, allowing them to let him, let us, hear Exodus in all its power and contemporary relevance. Now, listening means attending closely to the type of literature we are reading. And Chris rightly reads Exodus as an integrated whole and also draws constructively on the literary turn in Old Testament studies. Exodus, as he notes, is primarily narrative, but as such, it contains a host of other genres, law, song, genealogies, etc. And Chris is wonderfully attentive to these as he listens to Exodus, noting, for example, gaps in the narrative and if and how the reader might fill these. Recent years have foregrounded the important intertextuality in the Bible as text, as it were, speaks to text. And one thing I love about Chris's commentary is his mastery in his attention to the relationship between Genesis and Exodus, to the ways in which Exodus is picked up in the Psalms and the prophets, and of course the reception of Exodus in the New Testament. Where I find Chris's attention to intertextuality particularly helpful is his assessment of the function of law in Israel. More and more scholars are rightly stressing the difference between ancient Near Eastern law codes and contemporary ones, and noting, for example, that there is no evidence that Hammurabi's very well-known code was actually used in legal practice in Babylonia. However, some Christian scholars, by using this comparative idea, are moving in the direction of lessening the imperative aspect of Old Testament law for Israel. Now, Chris knows the ancient Near Eastern context well and alerts the reader to the major ancient Near Eastern law codes that have been discovered. But rightly, and I think this is a very important insight, insists that law in the Old Testament is uniquely, amongst ancient Near Eastern nations, covenantal. There's a whole lot of ways in which it's unique, its situation in the narrative, etc. And so we need to investigate how the Old Testament itself envisages law as functioning within Israel. And this enables Chris, and I think absolutely rightly so, to retain the imperative notion of Old Testament law in comparison as the debate goes with ancient Near Eastern law. Now, the goal of listening for the Bible as God's word must be to listen for God's address. Here, Chris's missional hermeneutic, which attends to the Bible as a great drama, is particularly fruitful, enabling him to remind us that we are not Old Testament Israel. But nevertheless, this is our story, and therefore our God who is at work in the story. The invitation to appropriate Exodus in this way resounds throughout Chris's commentary. Thirdly, instructed by Exodus. A great contribution of this commentary is its resistance to false reductionism. Chris resists the reduction of the Exodus to the political, but also the reduction of the Exodus to the spiritual. The Exodus, he notes, is a multifaceted event which has political, spiritual, and other dimensions, and all of them need to be taken into account. So too with the large body of law in Exodus. Chris's exposition of the Ten Commandments is a nuanced tour de force, in my opinion, and he rightly argues that although the laws of Exodus are given firstly for Old Testament Israel, they continue to be for our instruction. Indeed, on page 426, Chris lists 6 questions one can ask of any law in order to discern how it might apply today. Now, Chris has, of course, developed this paradigmatic approach in detail in his Old Testament ethics for the people of God. The genius of this approach, in my view, is that it resists applying Old Testament law directly to our context, while insisting simultaneously that it has much to say and to teach us for our context. And as is clearly apparent in the laws, what it has to say cannot be reduced to the spiritual, but speaks about all the many different dimensions of societal life, dimensions such as family, sexuality, law, ecology, building, work, craft, worship, art, economics, politics, etc. And so the result is that in Chris's commentary, as very much in Cass's commentary, you will find discussions of things like the midwives and civil disobedience. You will find discussions of authoritarian rule and politics. You will find discussions of ecology. You will find discussions of not just the healing of individuals, but the healing of societies. You will find Chris wonderfully alert to the surprising role of woman and Miriam as prophet in Exodus and so much more. And Chris tells this marvelous story of an Indian he met who was converted primarily through reading well into the Pentateuch, and who says in a way that only Chris can re-articulate, this God thinks of everything. Because Israel was formed by God into a full-orbed ancient Near Eastern nation, what Chris's move is of absolutely critical importance for contemporary ethics and public theology, because the Old Testament as a nation contains resources in this regard that we dare not ignore. Now, some of us in recent years have discovered the incredibly fertile work of the Jewish sociologist Philip Rieff. And in his creative trilogy, we witness in the book of Exodus, in his words, the translation of sacred order, God's order, into social order. A move that Rieff argues is absolutely imperative if a society is to avoid becoming what he calls one of death works. Now, in Exodus and in the Old Testament, we have, as it were, and I think Chris and I would both say this, an historically situated exemplar of this move of the translation of sacred order into social order. And it is one that we need to make in our different place in God's great story today, as we fulfill our vocation to be salt and light. Now, finally, Dave, I'm just about on time, fulfilled in the New Testament. Each passage in this commentary series is commented on in 3 areas: listen to the story, explain the story, and live the story. The identification of the Bible as story helpfully allows for a flow back and forth into the New Testament, and Chris navigates this flow exceptionally well. He reads forwards, but also backwards, allowing the light of Christ to illumine the whole. However, I think Chris and I would both say that there is something fundamental about reading forward. Brevard Child spoke in this respect of the discrete witness of the Old Testament, and in my view, it is important to affirm this. And I want to conclude in a bit provocatively by developing Luke's account of the Transfiguration into a modern parable in order to demonstrate this. I want you to imagine a group of evangelical pastors who have got to know Jesus well and are very excited about being part of his mission. They accompany up a mountain, and there he is transfigured, and Moses and Elijah appear with him, discussing his forthcoming departure. Once the pastors recover from the shock of getting a glimpse of Jesus' glory, they come up with an excellent idea for church planting. Master, they say, let's build a mega church right here. The Anglican evangelicals among them think we could call it the Church of the Transfiguration. The Baptists go for Church of all nations. But they all agree that Elijah and Moses could be part of the pastoral team. Just think, they say, what we could achieve. This will become the mega church of mega churches, and it will save you from all that messy talk you keep going on about in relation to some kind of brutal death lying ahead of you. If people can just see you like this and hear what Elijah and Moses have to say about you, church growth should be no problem. We will soon outgrow all the religious groups of our day, and we will be the major group in Israel and perhaps even in the Roman Empire. An admirable vision, but one that, like Peter, shows a massive misunderstanding of Jesus' mission. One word in the Greek of Luke's account explodes such an approach. Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, talk with Jesus about his exodus, is the Greek word, which he was to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Peter and our pastors want to stay on the mountain with the revelation of Jesus' glory. Moses and Elijah know that the revelation is for the disciples, but that precisely as the glorious one, Jesus must descend the mountain and begin the journey to Jerusalem and the cross if his exodus is to be achieved. The exodus from Egypt was a great redemption, but someone greater than Moses is present. Through his death and his resurrection, Jesus will lead the whole creation in an exodus from sin, death, and judgment. An exodus which will ultimately drain evil and distortion from every aspect of created life when he eventually ushers in the new heavens and the new earth. Until then, the church is, as Chris says, God's address on earth. And in this massive sense of Exodus, we are called to be an Exodus people, embodying and pointing to the liberation of all of life as it will become when Christ returns. Peter and our pastors have a small, narrow view of redemption. Moses and Elijah in the book of Exodus have a massive and comprehensive one. A great service of the book of Exodus is to expand our view of redemption. And Chris has provided us with a truly marvelous companion in this respect with his commentary. Thank you so much.